Hi, welcome. This is Wilfredo Hernandez on behalf of Brooklyn Community Pride Center and the LGBTQ New Americans Oral History Project. And I'm here with my co-interviewers.
Rebeca, Centeno.
And Jarrett, Lyons.
And today we're here with...
Hi, my name is Aya Tasaki. I'm here at the Brooklyn Community Pride Center. It is Sunday, June 17th, Father's Day 2018.
Thanks, Aya. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're actually the fifth narrator in our third collection of oral histories. Maybe you can start out by telling us a little bit about where you grew up.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I grew up in Tokyo, Japan. I'm turning 33 this year, but I was born in Tokyo, and when I was 5 years old, my family and I, my family meaning just my parents and I, moved to the north suburbs of Chicago, and it was for my father's job, which I think is kind of a typical story for a lot of Japanese families who end up overseas. It's whatever company that usually the father is working for will transfer them somewhere abroad for an opportunity. And so my parents and I moved to Chicago when I was 5 years old, and we knew from the beginning that was only going to be for 4 years. And so I lived in the north suburbs of Chicago, very white neighborhood, and it was like what I imagine is like a stereotypical American suburbia story where the grass in front of the houses that are kind of small, but then to me it seemed really huge because coming from Japan, where all the houses are stacked together and everything's just so narrow and everything's just cramped, it just felt so big. And so I went to a local public school there, and when I was 9, we moved back to Tokyo, and I went to a public school in Japan, in Tokyo. And again, I guess maybe this is kind of a stereotypical story, but my parents put me into what you call cram schools. And a cram school in Japan basically means as a kid, you go to these after-school classes where they're basically prepping you for an entrance exam into a private school. So I started going to one of those when I was like in 4th grade. So it was twice a week. After school, had to go to this tiny classroom where they're just cramming information into you, being like, okay, you're gonna make it into these top private schools. And as a kid, I was like, okay, I don't even know where Tokyo is on a map, and you're telling me like I have to learn like the entire history of Japan. But somehow my parents just sort of like suggested it to me as like a fun after school activity, and I was like, okay, and I just found myself in it. So I ended up, I feel like a lot of my memories of growing up in Japan between the age of 9 to I guess 12 or 13 years old was like consumed by just this weird cram school culture, which honestly was pretty abusive, I think. You have these teachers who are probably college students or just out of college, who are basically teaching kids how to prep for these entrance exams, and they were not nice. They're just like, oh, you have like eraser crumbs as brains, and you're so stupid, and it was just that kind of culture. And so I feel like a lot of my memories are kind of overshadowed by that, and the feeling of, okay, I need to get this right and make it into this private school, whatever it is. And then so took the entrance exams, got into a pretty good all-girls private middle school. And middle school in Japan is from 7th grade to 9th grade, and then high school is from 10th grade to 12th grade. But usually that's all included in one school. So you would be together with the same people from 7th grade to 12th grade. And and so I made it into this private middle school, and it was a really interesting experience. It was all girls, which is also pretty common in Japan. There are a lot of co-ed schools, but there are definitely many just all girls schools and all boys schools, and that's still common. And when I was, almost done with 8th grade, my father said, "Hey, we're gonna go back to the States again because my company's transferring us," and but he said, "But we're not going until in 2 years, and before that, we're gonna move to this other part of Japan called Sapporo, which is up north." And he was like, "And we're gonna be there for 2 years before we go to the States." And so I'm just like, okay, well, this is happening. It's not like there was any option. It was, wherever my family went, of course I went. And so we moved to this other part of Japan, and because we knew that we were going back to the States, they put me in an international school in Sapporo. And because this place that we moved to was very rural and very small, the international school only had 10 students to a grade, which is really, again, very interesting. And I feel like majority of the students there were either, kids of missionaries, kids of really rich Russian fishermen, or just kids who happened to have one parent who was not Japanese and was maybe teaching at a university. So it was a very interesting mix of people. And so I spent 2 years at this international school, and then in 2 years we returned back to the States into pretty much the same area we lived in when I was 5 years old, just because of where my father's company was located. And I went to a high school, so going from 10 students per grade to a high school that had 5,000 students. And it was really interesting because of how big the school was. It served a really rich neighborhood, but then also served a very working class, mostly Latino neighborhood. So the culture was very interesting. I mean, when I was in the cafeteria, I remember there was a fight that broke out between the Korea-born Koreans and the American-born Koreans, and the cops came, and I was just like, okay, I thought I knew America, but I guess I didn't. So it was this weird sort of experience, because I was going back into a community that I thought I knew a little bit at least, and then spent the last 2 years of my high school again in the north suburbs of Chicago. Then when I graduated from high school, my parents moved back to Japan for good, and I started undergrad. I went to a very small liberal arts school with 1,300 students, and I graduated there, which was the first school that I actually started and ended at, because I'd moved around so much since I was younger. And so that was my first experience being like, okay, I started in one place and I'm ending at one place, and I have a cohort of people that see me from the beginning to end of this experience. So that was pretty special. And then I worked in Chicago for a year. And I was, still on the student visa thing. So I was like, okay, what am I gonna do? Am I gonna try to find a job here, or am I gonna further my education? And so at that point, I was really interested in just doing international affairs, kind of like nonprofit on an international level. And so I just said, okay, well, I should be in New York for that. And so I applied for school in New York and moved to New York in 2009, and I've been here ever since.
What did you study in school?
So I studied in undergrad. I studied international relations, and then I got a master's in international affairs in New York. And then still, I was very confused about what I was doing with my life. And I think when I finished my master's in New York, I just was kind of questioning, am I really going to work for a place like the UN? Like, it just did not really click with me. And by that time, I had gotten into doing a lot of organizing in New York, especially around like with the POC queer community, and so I was like, okay, I just can't imagine doing some like being with an organization like the UN, and so. Partly spurred by the fact that I just didn't know what I was doing, and another part being like, okay, I still have this like immigration thing to like really, I couldn't just willy-nilly just hang around and have a random job. I was like, okay, what am I gonna do? Am I gonna do a PhD? That also just sounds like, that means I would just operate in academia for the rest of my life. That just didn't make any sense. So the one other option that just came up was like, maybe you should go to law school, which was not my idea, honestly. It was really just folks around me suggesting maybe like you would actually be good at that, or that you would actually enjoy going to law school. And I had no idea. I didn't know a single lawyer, no interest in law whatsoever. But really, I think I decided to go to law school partly because I knew I was really invested in just working with and for communities, especially immigrant communities and just like POC communities. And so I ended up going to law school. Worst 3 years of my life. But I will say that I did a year-long clinic, which was the Immigrant Justice Clinic, and that was an amazing experience, and it really made me realize that just different ways of organizing and different ways that we can all utilize our skills and move whatever movement forward. So And I think because of that experience, I'm able to do the job I have now, which is a lot of policy and advocacy work. And I feel like I'm really able to merge my passion and my organizing experience and my legal experience and all of that together. So I think I'm in a good place now to say that, okay, law school is horrible, but I'm grateful for that experience. Yeah.
Certainly a lot of work.
Yeah.
At what point, kind of in your educational journey, did you come to either identify or associate with, like you said, queer POC groups?
So when I was in undergrad, I know the seeds were there, but I definitely didn't feel very, so in undergrad, the year I started, a brand new director for the Intercultural Affairs Office also started, and he kind of became my mentor. I think we just connected in the beginning, and I think he saw something in me and really started offering me opportunities, whether it was to work over the summer to coordinate this special orientation program for the incoming POC international student population, and he also invited me to co-facilitate a class that he was teaching that was about like diversity and social issues. And so he definitely gave me all these opportunities to really engage in those kinds of conversations. But in undergrad, I feel like I just threw myself into anything that was social justice because I really enjoyed connecting with people who are like fighting for something. And I don't think that I really honestly took the time to understand why these issues meant a lot to me, or how I actually fit into the conversation truly, based on my background or based on my gender or race, like sexuality, all of that stuff. I just threw myself in there because I just really craved the community, and I really just enjoyed being in that space and building with people around these issues. And I was part of like the pride group on campus, but I realize now that the reason I didn't feel so 100% connected was because it was very white. And so that was my undergrad experience, which I really appreciated, and I think I learned a lot from. But I think after moving to New York, I moved to New York with my girlfriend at the time, but we broke up shortly after we got to New York. And then so it was more of like, oh my God, I'm here all alone in New York. What am I gonna do? Google queer, like New York, whatever. And then this organization came up in this Google search, and it was the Audre Lorde Project. And the Audre Lorde Project has been around, oh my gosh, I don't even know for how long now. But they're basically like a community organizing organization, led by and for queer and trans people of color. And I knew nothing. I mean, I didn't even know who the hell Audre Lorde was at that point. But I think the website, something just spoke to me, and I think on their website there was just a lot of words like community and like political, and all those like keywords kind of pulled me in. And I was like, okay, well, and at that time I was a student, so I was like, well, I have time and I can just go and check it out. And yeah, I mean, really all I had at the time was like, I had spare time to offer and I wanted community. So I just ended up being able to offer my time to them. And I was just like, I'm just gonna show up and do whatever. And it was really the luxury and privilege of having time to spare that really connected me and allowed me to build community. And so it was there that I really started doing a lot of just like immigrant rights work within the queer trans community. And then I think after a while, I started realizing, okay, well, there aren't a lot of Asian identified people here, or that I felt like I wasn't connecting to this other part of myself. And I was like, okay, maybe it's about time that I actually try to connect to like the API community. And I think a part of that also came from the fact that I was starting to become very aware of how like disconnected or uncomfortable I felt about Japan. And that had always been there, this sort of like growing anger towards Japan, but just because of like a lot of experiences that I've had, and of course like moving back and forth and not having, and when I was younger, having a lot of negative experiences about being Japanese or just being different in the States, and those were kind of unresolved. And then going back to Japan as like a young girl and being like, what the hell is this place? Like, and then there was like a lot of unresolved things, and I just kept on turning away from that part of my identity. And I think being around a lot of like very aware like queer trans POC folks who were very proud of and just really exercising different ways of reclaiming their identity, I think really sort of sparked something in me, being like, okay, I have to like at least start to like get right with myself in that way. And then so I eventually started organizing with the queer API community in New York, which is very robust. And again, I just really think that it was the privilege of being able to offer volunteer time and just not have to worry about survival in terms of material things really allowed me to show up and spend time with this community in ways that I probably wouldn't have been able to if I really had to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. I didn't have to worry so much about that, and so I got connected to the queer API community in New York, and then eventually I ended up being on the board of NCAPIA, which is the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, and that's like a federation of 40 plus grassroots queer API orgs who are organizing all over the US. And so that was life-changing for me. And you know, I think the main thing that's been sort of like a thread throughout my life is like I've always craved community and family. I mean, I love my parents, and they've been so supportive of me for my entire life, really. But I think there's definitely something about being an only child and having to move through these kinds of experiences, like moving from country to country and city to city, and not having anybody else as a witness to what I was going through. And then just like not having childhood friends. Like I didn't grow up in a faith community, so I never really had like a space to share certain things. And so when I really became connected to and organizing with the queer API community, it's just been so important for me, because it's like, I am able to like love and be loved by other queer API people, and it's like that's like so powerful. So that's been like my sort of like general trajectory and how organizing and, you know, community spaces have sort of become a part of my life.
You talk a lot about community and the work, kind of. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see that playing out in the world? Like, what is that work? What does that look like? Or what does good work look like?
Oh my gosh, good work. Good work in this world right now. Good work in this world. I think I obviously there are like multiple parts to this, I think, sure. But I honestly think that because part of it I've just been really realizing is because we live right now in a world of like Facebook and like emailing as like main mode of communication, I think that I'm really realizing how powerful like actual FaceTime is with folks. And I just feel like I hear so many conversations around me of like, hi, I'm so-and-so. We've known each other for 5 years. I'm that person you've been corresponding with. And I think that's great that we have so many like ways to connect with each other and like find each other. But like the sheer energy of being able to share a space physically with people, even if you're not like deep in conversation with that person, I think is so powerful. And it just, I think it just goes a long way. Even if it's just like, oh yeah, I saw you at this event, you know, it's like enough to sort of, I don't know, at least for me, like create this bond in saying that, yes, we were both invested in being in that space and invested in being, I don't know, part of whatever work was happening in that space. And I think that really builds like an inherent trust when there's like clear sort of connection based on the fact that you both have invested in the same kind of work or the same kind of space or the same kind of community, and that community has also in turn invested in you, then I just feel like it creates like this inherent trust or bond. So I think part of good work right now, especially when we are very reliant on online interactions, even if it's like a Skype conversation, I think is very different than an email or a phone call even. And so just different ways of exchanging energy, I think is a really important part of doing good work right now, I think. And then I think that being in partnership and building coalitions is especially important right now, but I think another part of that is also really connecting with folks that you share very particular identities with is equally as important in this political climate. Because I think for me, at least, when I really think about my experience, my commitment and passion for the work that I do has continued to develop and increase and evolve in a very particular way ever since I really started to step into my own identities. And so what that looks like for me is, as I said, like really connecting with the queer API community is really, really important. And also like connecting to other POCs, especially like East Asian folks who have some level of wealth, has been really important to me, because I think we just don't talk about class stuff enough, and so that's been really important. And I think the most recent sort of community that I've been connecting to that's been really, really important to me is like a community of survivors of like sexual assault, and all of those spaces are so important to me, at least, because I think continuing to do work on ourselves and then leaning into those different types of communities will only allow you to be more creative and imaginative about what collaboration and partnership looks like. Because I feel like ultimately I need to have like collaboration inside of me. Like all of those identities need to collaborate inside of me at some point. And I can't just ignore certain identities. And I just feel like I was doing that for way too long. I hated being Japanese. I hated Japan. And then by default, I think I had just like so much like internalized racism. And so that just obviously wasn't going to get me very far if I was really committed to doing work in my own community and then also trying to build something bigger. So I think it's great that a lot of us are acknowledging, okay, we can't just be siloed and we have to really show up for each other. I think that's super important, but at the same time, I think we really also, there is so much value in investing in these separate spaces as well with a particular intention. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit in detail about the work you've done for immigration rights and kind of like day-to-day challenges, successes, things like that?
Sure. So I feel like I've always been pulled towards doing immigrant rights work, and maybe I didn't 100% understand why I was pulled to those spaces, but I mean, obviously, I guess I'm an immigrant, so I guess it makes sense. But I think one of the really interesting things is that every time I threw myself into like immigrant rights or immigrant community organizing, I was always coming at it from this perspective of an ally. And I think the main reason I felt like an ally was because I was very, very focused on how much more privileged I was compared to a lot of the folks whose voices needed to be front and center. And you know, I never had an experience being undocumented. I never had an experience where, you know, my family migrated because of fear. I never had the experience of my parents having to hold down multiple jobs to feed me. And, you know, I mean, really, like, when you're from Japan, like, Japan is not just Asia or East Asia. Japan is like white people in Asia, right? Like, we just don't, like, we just never talk about why did Japan get to where it is now. And it's just like basically because we like fucked over entire Asia, and like we can get away with continuing to do that because, oh look, there's America in the news and they're always doing things worse than us, so like we can just cruise on by basically kind of doing the same thing, maybe on a smaller scale because maybe we're kind of contained to Asia, but you know, I don't think we really ever talk about that. But that's just to say that I think I focused so much on the privileges that I had, and throwing myself into immigrant rights organizing was a big part of it was really like ignoring my own experiences and just being like, how can I support this movement as an ally with like a shit ton of privilege basically, but then I think at a certain point, like I realized that a lot of where that idea was coming from was based on this like intense internalized racism that I had towards myself and towards my people. And so there definitely was a turning point where I was like, okay, I need to like really start understanding my own story and my narrative, because I need to be able to place myself into this bigger movement and fight that I'm so passionate about. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean like I'm gonna parade around talking about my story or like trying to lift up my story to like fight for space, but it was really mainly about like my internal work of like how like I just need to get that part straight and understand how I fit into all of this in order to continue the work in the way that I really want to. So I think one of the biggest things that I realized is that, okay, we are, as immigrants, we are all harmed by the exact same system, which I think that it is based on the complete model of scarcity. It's just like, well, if we give citizenship to you, somehow it's gonna dilute my citizenship or some. There's just and it's like the narrative of like the good immigrant, bad immigrant, all of that, and then having access to different types of visas, and you know, so I think the challenge I really had was the main challenge I had really was to understand the importance of my own story and how that and acknowledging that the reason that it's important is because it is all a part of this system that I'm trying to fight against, basically. Yeah, so I mean that's definitely ongoing, and I think another part that I'm really interested and invested in right now is really connecting more to the Japanese American community, because getting an education in Japan, you don't ever really hear about Japanese diaspora outside of Japan. And I mean, like, you look at Brazil, like there's a huge, like it has the largest Japanese population outside of Japan. We never talk about it. When Peru had a president whose last name was Fujimori, we never talked about why he had a Japanese last name. It's just like a random guy in like in this other part of the world who happens to have like this Japanese last name. Like, we just never talk about those things. And especially I think in the States, it's really important for me to connect and learn more about the Japanese American community because I don't share a history with them in terms of like the internment history. Like my family didn't go through that, but personally, like one of my really important parts of my history is that my entire family is from Hiroshima, and both of my grandmothers are survivors of the atomic bomb, and so it's just it's all part of the bigger picture, and it is a shared history, and it's also really important for me, I think, to witness Japanese folks thriving outside of Japan, because I'm the only person here from my family in the States, and it's and I think, you know, I know that I cannot thrive in Japan, even though my family can. And so to be able to see the Japanese American community who have like generational roots in the States and like really thriving and really having community with each other is really kind of like a new area of this like personal work that I'm doing to really continue my commitment to immigrant rights work. Yeah.
And you have this conflicting feelings about Japanese culture and things like that. Where did your queer identity fit into that? Was that?
Oh man. Okay, so let's see, queer identity in Japanese culture. So I admittedly don't know so much about what it means to be a queer person in Japan today. But I think so talking about my sort of discomfort / anger really towards Japan, I mean, originally it really definitely came from when I moved back to Japan as a 9-year-old. It was just a complete shock because everybody looked like me, and I could fit in perfectly fine because when I'm in Japan and speak Japanese, I pass as just native Japanese person. And I think there, in my kid's brain, like I had this like inherent sort of not understanding, but this thought that, okay, I'm supposed to feel, like I fit in because everybody looks like me, I speak the same language. But I feel like my creativity and my sort of I have made it in America like thing was quickly like shut down. And I think this just has to do a lot with how like homogenous Japan pretends to be still. And so I definitely, looking back, I think I definitely resent how I felt like my creativity and was shut down and replaced with like just academic rigor. So there's that. And then I think the other really big part is just what it means to be a young girl in Japan. Like Japanese pop culture and things that you just see everywhere, whether it's on TV, advertising, on like the trains or anywhere, and just billboards everywhere. It is like, there's just no excuse, but it's just like straight up pedophilia, I think, in my opinion. There is such value placed on like the innocent young like girl sort of thing, and it's like consumed by everybody as like a normal thing. And so you have like like the pop culture would be like, I don't know, like a popular group would be like 40 girls who are in their like pre-teens to teens who are like dressed up, I don't know, like in mini skirts and like frilly things and dancing and singing about like love or dating or some weird like drama anime fantasy world, and then you look out into the audience and it's like, sure, like there are younger girls consuming that, but then like a big part of the audience is like older men, right? And like, and just like the messaging that you get as a young girl is like so violent, and people are just like complacent. It's just like, I mean, it's just like, why would on a subway where you're expected to take the subway to go to school as like a 13-year-old every day, or even younger a lot of times, and the advertising you're seeing is like, there's like a girl in her bikini advertising some sleazy magazine, and she's probably like 14 years old, and the magazine is geared towards like men like 30 and older. And then just to be bombarded with that was just really was not okay. And when I was 13 years old, like between like the ages of 13 and when I moved out of Tokyo, which would have been like maybe 15 or 16, like I was like a victim of multiple sexual assaults as like a young girl. And it's like, I would look at photos of myself when I was like that age, and I was just like, okay, like this is a child. Like I can remember how I felt as a young person then. Like, of course I felt like a cool, I'm still adult, like that kind of punk ass thing. But when you look at the photo, it's just like, this is a fucking child. And to know that I had friends around me who, like, I mean, I don't know how common this was, but I mean, if there were a few around me, I know there were a bunch more. Like, there were friends around me who wouldn't hesitate to just go on a date with some like random old man in the street, and they'll like make change, you know? And it's just like, who is protecting us from any of this? And who is protecting any of us from this messaging? And like, how did we become so casual about it? And then even as young girls, like we just didn't see how it was such a big deal. And I think it's only after I moved away and had all this anger that I just didn't really understand, and then also connecting with survivor community in the States, that I was just like, okay, like there's something clearly wrong. And so there's a lot of that, and I think, you know, for a long time I think that I didn't want to talk about survivorship because I didn't want people to equate that with my queerness. But then, like right now, I'm honestly at a point where I think I do believe like 100% that there are many of us who were born queer or whatever, right? But I'm also kind of like, okay, but so what if somebody actually chooses to be like whatever identity they have based on experiences? And I'm not saying that that's what happened to me, and I don't need to understand why I have a queer identity, or like why my sexuality is the way it is, or like why my gender presentation or all of that is the way it is. But But I think that's one of the things that I've like been really thinking about a lot. It's just like, okay, like is the only comeback to like to people saying like being queer or trans is like so XYZ, like bad, is the only comeback we have to that just being like, well, I was just born this way, right? And it's just like, it's just unfixable. It's just like, but I'm just like, okay, but so what if somebody chose to like, because I just feel like as much as like people don't want to admit it, like sex is super complicated, right? And so I think it's been really important for me to understand my relationship to Japan, to my experiences there, because of course it's very healing, but I think at the same time it's also allowing me to understand what it means to connect to other people, like in an intimate way, in a non-romantic way, romantic ways, and I think it's going to be a never-ending journey, and I'm fine with that. But I imagine that a part of that journey eventually is going to look like me spending time in Japan, whether it's short or long, but like really sort of physically being there and re-examining my childhood there in a particular way. And I think one thing that I'm really looking forward to is I've never had any of my significant others go with me to Japan. And I imagine the first time that I go to Japan with whoever I'm in a romantic relationship with is going to be a very important point in my healing journey, because I don't think I've ever experienced what it's like to be loved in a certain way, like while I'm physically in this space that I feel like has done harm to me or has hurt me. And so I'm really looking forward to that day, and I feel like there's gonna be some emotional like shift or maybe some sort of closure in a way, to allow me to move forward in understanding the relationship between my queer identity and my relationship to Japan.
Can you talk a little bit about the work you do now with Survivors?
Sure. So right now I work at an organization called Womankind, and it used to be called the New York Asian Women's Center. And it's been a direct service provider for the greater Asian community mainly for the past 35 years, working with survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking. And the organization works with individuals across the lifespan. So we have like very young kids to elders, because we also have an elder abuse program. And I think a really important, and I feel like I started this job at a very like opportune moment in my personal life as well, because I do really believe it fits into my healing journey and understanding my own story, because majority of the individuals who work at the organization are social workers, and in order to be a social worker at the agency, you have to be fluent in another Asian language. And what that means is the staff composition looks like maybe 70% or more were born and raised outside of the U.S. and then also 90 whatever percent identify as Asian, and also 90 something percent identify as women. And so in my particular position, I'm not a social worker, so my position is doing policy and advocacy work. And I feel I worked with the organization as a legal intern like 5 maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And so during that experience, I got to work directly with survivors. And because I speak Japanese, they gave me all of the Japanese clients who needed legal support. And so that was already sort of like a significant moment in time for me, because I was working with survivors and speaking about this particular kind of trauma in Japanese, which I had never done in my life. And that was really powerful, even though I wasn't speaking about my own experience, but just like to share similar kinds of experience with somebody who's Japanese and speaks the Japanese language was very, very significant. And right now I don't do any direct client work, but it is really powerful for me to really imagine what it could look like to really amplify the voices of this particular community, like beyond the individual healing, and try to connect it to bigger movements, bigger things that are happening in our country and then in the world, what's happening in the greater gender-based violence field. And so you know, there, and none of it can happen in a vacuum, right? Like all of the things intersect. It's about like race and gender and class, and whenever like a bill or something is introduced, it's not just what the bill is about, but it's about how is it going to be implemented. It's going to be implemented in a community or a society where there is heavy policing, there is racism, whether we want to believe it or not, and the racism doesn't just exist like between communities, it exists within communities. And there's like all this stigma about like sex workers, and there's all this stigma about like what it means to be a single parent, or what it means to be working class. Like there's just so many things, and I think, and also I think one of the really interesting, important things that I'm really learning through this work is that justice looks so different for individual people. I mean, there are survivors of domestic violence within a lot of Asian communities where actually, yes, like maybe my spouse is being very abusive and it is currently a very dangerous situation, but my ultimate form of justice has nothing to do with me physically living separately from my abuser. Because for me to actually sustain myself and thrive, I need that community or that partnership to be intact, because that is that's like where the core of my community is, and if that's broken up, then I lose everything. And so it's also about understanding how to understand what true agency looks like for individuals, and then to understand what justice looks like for individuals. And I think through that I'm really learning about myself, about okay, like what does justice look like for me, for example, like what does justice for like the 13-year-old me look like, right? And I've never thought about that, and so those kinds of things I'm definitely getting like hints about my own self by doing this kind of work.
Given, thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, given the current political moment, what advice would you give to people out there who are looking to get involved and make change and make a difference in the lives of other people?
Yeah, I think definitely right now there, like for all different reasons, there are a lot of folks who have been catalyzed, for lack of a better word. And of course there are many more who have been doing invisible work, basically. But I think for folks who are like really feeling like, oh my gosh, I want to do something or I want to be involved, I think I really do support the idea of showing up. And this goes back to something that I was saying earlier, but just physically showing up to a space, and you don't have to like do anything but like show up to a space with the full on intention of like connecting to people or just even witnessing what's happening, I think is crucial. And I think a lot of people, I imagine, feel like they are already witnessing something when they're consuming things through social media, but I think there's just so much power in just like physically being in a space. And it doesn't have to be physical presence at a rally. It can just be like a potluck in your community, or I don't know, like a movie screening. Like I think that there is something to be said about like how your body reacts to the energy in a space. And I think when you experience something like that, it does sustain you to keep going or showing up to these spaces and doing the work. And I think it also is a very important part about building community, because then other people are seeing you in that space. And like for example, one of the most important events for me during Pride Month is the Trans Day of Action, which is like on the Friday before the Manhattan Pride. And there are many folks there who I have never really spoken to or had an actual like one-on-one interaction with, but I know like there are so many familiar faces, and I know they recognize me as a familiar face, and the power and the energy of that, like inherently I know that this is my community, and that we know how to show up for each other in different ways. And so that just really makes me believe in the power of this like idea of showing up into spaces. And then the other thing that I really want to like for us to think about is what it really means to not just like listen to like the directly impacted communities or like the voices that tend to be pushed to the side, like not just hear, but to actually like what does it really mean to believe those voices, and like what does it mean to give full credit and to those stories and voices, and how does that look like? And because a lot of times it's just like, yes, like hear these voices or like honor these voices, but like I think all of us have a really long way to go, especially because of all of the things that we've been socialized with, is like, okay, like how much are you actually giving full credit, and are you really believing this person's story? And so that's like a personal challenge that I have for myself, but like to everybody else. And also share food. Like sharing food is really great. Like it is the key thing, I think, that like sustains us through this work and connects us, because yeah, I mean, also part of me is just like, you don't want to share food. That's like kind of like questionable. So I think sharing food is always very important in like being in this work. And you don't have to cook. You can just bring food. Like, this is my favorite food. Let's share it. Like, I think that's always really good too. So those are my kind of connected but maybe not connected advice.
That's great advice. Well, we're nearing the end of our time together. I would ask, what do you want people to know about LGBTQ immigrants?
I would like people to know that the LGBTQ immigrant community that we have very different stories, and I think honestly a lot of times we are very imperfect because as a LGBTQ immigrant community we're often pitted against each other, and I think one of the things that pits us against each other is just the immigration system itself. And so like one of the big examples that I can think of is when like DOMA was gone and there was marriage equality. You know, of course, like the problem I think with how like the whole conversation around marriage equality happened was because like all of the resources were being pulled into achieving this marriage equality thing, which obviously only benefits a very certain group of people within our community. So obviously there was a big problem there in terms of resources, but then that's also another thing about resources, right? It's just like model of scarcity where we're just gonna like pour everything into this and we're just gonna ignore all this other stuff. But so while I definitely understand the problems of how that all happened, at the same time, like we can't deny that ruling and marriage equality, how much that's done for a lot of LGBTQ immigrants. Like that has been a way for folks to stay in the country, and I think also just this complete, again, like model of scarcity, right? It's always about like, where are the resources going? We don't have enough resources here. You just take these like little crumbs and just fight over it. And I think that happens so much in the LGBTQ community. But at the same time, I want the rest of the world and also our like LGBTQ community to know that we also know how to show up for each other. And I think most of us have the desire to show up for each other, and also like we are so powerful as like a community, especially in the States, because you know, even though we are like as like the US is kind of like tumbling down this hill of being this like awesome country and like beacon of light for the rest of the world, I think it is still true that a lot of queer communities in other countries still look to how we work with each other in the US, and so we are really powerful, I think, and there is power in the fact that our stories are so diverse and so complicated and so nuanced, and yeah, I just want everybody to know that like we are really damn proud to be part of this community, and it's just like just let us be proud and let us like lead things, and you know, it's just like just take the white men out of like leadership. Like there are so many things that's like, oh, look what happens when you put like a black trans woman in charge of this thing. Like look at, like so many of us had to imagine in order to just survive. So it's just like, if we have that imagination already, like imagine what you can like have if you put us into leadership positions. Like we know how to imagine things, we know how to be creative, we know how to be super like resourceful, and so it's just like, just trust us, you know. Yeah.
Is there anything you want viewers to know about you at the end of this interview?
I just want everybody to know that that I really owe everything to the queer POC community, like where I'm at now, and I know that I am so fortunate to have found and connected and have built with a community, and to have people that I can call my family, and you know, and every single person deserves to have that, because we just cannot, we can't survive or thrive without each other, and I am just so grateful for not just my close friends, but just everybody who I've shared space with. Like the queer trans POC community just has changed me and is continuing to change me and hold me accountable, and so I'm just so grateful, and my hope is that I just want to be able to offer that to anybody who is searching for that, or at least point them towards a door or something. Like that would just be my absolute just goal in life. If more people can experience, or as many people can experience like what I've experienced and what I continue to experience. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I think that concludes our interview.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. This is really wonderful.
Cool. So what's going on? What are those?
So, I think this is still pretty popular, but especially when I was growing up, I think this started becoming really popular probably when I was like in like 5th grade. This is called Purikura, which is like short for print club, and I think it's because the first company maybe to come out with it was calling it that. But basically it's little tiny photos that are stickers, and you can like choose your frame, and now they've gotten all of these fancy things where you can like make your eyes bigger or like make your skin whiter, obviously, because that's what everybody wants to do apparently. But I think for me this is like so symbolic of Japan and like what my experience growing up in Japan was like, because it's just like, I mean, it's a big deal if you like are hanging out with your friends and you take these like little photos, and you're just like collecting it, but it also becomes kind of like a status symbol in a way, I feel like, because it's like, look at all these friends I have, and we're just like taking these photos. And then sometimes you'll just like trade photos, so you end up with like photos with not even yourself in it. But I feel like for me, this was always a big deal, because like you know, I would have like secret crushes on people, and I'm like, oh my god, I have like this photo with this person. So yeah, I definitely have a lot of those. Like these are like the special ones with like people that I had crushes on or something, you know, and I would like write little like, I don't know, captions on them. So yeah, I haven't looked up this in a really long time, but yeah, I was collecting those, obviously, in Japan. Okay. So these are some items that have a pretty big significance for me. So this is I guess like a typical I guess it's called bell, that a lot of, or I guess all of the altars in Japan would have. And you know, it's got like a very nice that kind of like reverberating, nice sound to it. And this was part of my grandparents' altar. They had for decades and decades. It might have actually been from a few generations back even. But when my grandparents' house, we tore it down, my parents took the Buddha statue and they gave this to me. So I have it by my bed. It reminds me of that house and my grandparents. And this is a rosary bead that belonged to my grandmother. And these are actually all just rosary beads that would be, kind of stored in the altar. And I imagine that she just like ended up collecting them, or, people would give them to her and she just ended up with a bunch of them. And so I got that from her. There's some other things. So my grandfather was a professional calligrapher, and he hand carved these stamps with his signature on it that he would stamp on each piece. And they're made with like really nice stone. And I also got this when they were cleaning out the house after my grandparents passed away. So that's really important to me. I feel like in this whole thing, it might actually be a really important to talk about my tattoos, because that's like very significant. So I don't know how much you can see, but and then there are paper cranes all over my back as well. My entire family is from Hiroshima, and both of my grandmothers are survivors of the atomic bomb. And this right here is a statue that's in the Peace Park in Hiroshima, where the atomic bomb is. And it's of a 12 or 13-year-old girl named Sadako, who I think maybe some folks are familiar with. She was the main character in Sadako and the Paper Cranes, which is a true story. So she basically passed away from leukemia after the atomic bomb. And while she was sick in the hospital, she would fold paper cranes like out of like the little medicine wrapping papers and stuff. And so it became a symbol of peace, I guess, around the world, but especially like in the wake of this like atomic bomb basically happening. And so it's really significant to me. And I have 8 paper cranes across my back, and I got 8 because I have a very small family, and the people who I consider to be my blood family is like my parents, myself, my 4 grandparents, and my aunt, and that's 8. So I got this tattoo actually last year, and it's really significant because tattoos are very taboo in Japan.
I was gonna ask that, yeah.
It's very much stigmatized. It's connected to the Yakuza, which are like the underground mafia. And especially for women, it's just like Japan is just not on the trend of tattoos at all. And I think it's going to be a very long time before if it even happens. And for me, getting this tattoo was really partly just being like, you know what, I am never going back to Japan to live, because that's just not a place where I can thrive in. And I think another really significant part about this tattoo was it was really about like kind of an act of reclaiming my body, but in a way, but not reclaiming it from like a country that I know has done harm to me, but not in a way where I'm trying to cut all roots, but just to really remind myself that that I will always be Japanese, and sort of like redefining that relationship for myself and to my body as well. And I'm sure this will effectively like shun me from almost all the hot springs actually in Japan. But who knows, maybe they're becoming more lenient because, all the damn foreigners are coming in with tattoos, or I don't know. But I haven't been back to Japan since I got this tattoo, so I have no idea how that's gonna go down. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.